Hello, we are in the American part of the Gaia World Tour. I'm happy to present you Ali Milin from Art into Acres. How are you, Ali?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Okay. So in 5 minutes, we're going to talk with Thomas Lovejoy and Enrique. I will let you present them. But just before, we have an interview of Jane Goodall about the World Animal Day. Raphael or Theo, can you launch it, please?
Hello, this is Jane Goodall, and on this World Animal Day, I want to give a little message about animals. I was born loving them. I spent hours as a child outside watching the birds and the squirrels and a fox, if I could manage it, in the garden here in the UK, where, by the way, I've been on lockdown since the beginning of the pandemic. And there was no television back then, so I learned from nature and from books. I had this amazing opportunity. Well, I worked for it, but I got to study the animals more like us than any other living creature, the chimpanzees. And they share 98.6% of their DNA with us. And they kiss, embrace, hold hands. They wage a kind of war, but they show love, compassion, and altruism. There's good and bad mothers. And knowing all this, how shocking that when, after 2 years, I went to Cambridge University, I was told by many professors that I couldn't talk about chimpanzee personality or mind or emotion because those were unique to us. Well, fortunately, because of the biological similarity in all the descriptions and film coming from Gombe National Park about the chimpanzees, science was forced out of that reductionist way of thinking. And we now realize we are part of and not separate from the rest of the animal kingdom. And today you can study animal personality, you can study animal emotions, but of course animal intelligence, they are so much more intelligent than we ever used to think. And that's not just the great apes and the elephants and the whales and the dolphins, it's birds, it's pigs, it's all the animals we mistreat in our intensive farming. Each one of them a personality with a mind and feeling fear and feeling pain. The rats are incredibly intelligent. The giant forest rats have been trained to discover landmines buried deep under the ground. Birds, incredibly intelligent. Some crows can solve problems faster than some human infants. Birds are amazingly intelligent, and some crows can solve certain problems faster than a 7-year-old human. And even the octopus are amazingly intelligent, and they're so different from us, with 9 brains, 1 in the head and 1 in each arm. And they can solve all kinds of problems. So we have a lot to learn still about these amazing animals. And one thing is clear, we need to stop the cruelty. It's our disrespect of animals that in part has led to this pandemic. Because we destroy their habitat, we push them closer to humans in some places. A virus can jump from an animal to a person and maybe can create a new disease like COVID-19. We hunt them, shoot them, eat them, we traffic them, we send them or their parts around the world. There's the mostly illegal exotic pet trade. They're sold in the wildlife markets of Asia. And that's indeed where COVID-19 is thought to have begun. Killing and eating chimpanzees in Central Africa led to HIV/AIDS, and many so-called zoonotic diseases have arisen from the cruel, overcrowded, unhygienic conditions of the intensive animal farms, the factory farms. And so, for our own sake, we need to show greater compassion, understanding, and respect for animals. And that means we must also respect their habitat. And it's our disrespect of the habitat that's landed us in this climate crisis. We need to get together as a human family around the world and somehow work out a better way of dealing with, of interacting with animals and the environment to create a better future, a greener economy, respect for all life. Thank you.
So, yeah, this was Jen Goodall. Ale, Méline, you wanted to talk about this, and you prepare a PowerPoint to explain what you are doing.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Adrian. Well, it's a pleasure to listen to Jane's words just now, today on World Animal Day. And I look forward to the coming hour speaking with Tom Lovejoy, who's currently in DC, and Enrique Ortiz. Tom and I work quite a lot in terms of education, and myself, I work with Enrique for land conservation, both of these things within the Americas for biodiversity. So my name's Haley Mellon, and I live in San Francisco, California. I'm a painter and a large-scale land conservationist. I focus mostly on very traditional land conservation, looking at factors of biodiversity, connectivity, which means conserving areas that are congruous to pre-conserved areas. We work with scale, so we usually conserve in areas that are 30,000 acres or larger, usually up to around 5 million, and focus quite a lot on community requested conservation. So as a painter and as a conservationist, I noticed that both art and large-scale land conservation or national parks have a lot to do with legacy and permanence, what we leave behind, and what stories we push forward, and what we emphasize as being important in the world. So I founded a nonprofit initiative called Art to Acres. We'll look at that a bit now, and then we'll get to talk with Enrique from Andy's Amazon Fund, who's one of the great conservationists of our time, who's originally from Peru, and Dr. Tom Lovejoy from the UN Foundation, also professor, and Tom founded the World Biodiversity. So on this great day for animals, we get to talk to one of the masters. So first, I'll just speak a little bit about Art into Acres. I work mostly with artists throughout the world, and one painting conserves one location. I like it because they're both about scale. They're both, a shape, a square, a triangle, and something that's 22 inches can then conserve 6 miles of land. Both art and our conserved areas have to do with both what we leave behind, but they also have to do with this notion of artifact. I like that an artwork is really a moment in time, but when you go to, for example, Yosemite or a great regional park or national park, you go into the wildlands, you're really looking at all time compounded. I mean, that's just what the world looks like after so many millions of years have passed. So in terms of the Art to Acres, here's some of the artworks that we've worked with. It's a beautiful Jonas Wood painting. Fantastic Olivia Massé. It's a small red painting that he made for an artist friend of his, Marcia, who was recently deceased. A nice Cindy Sherman print, and Cindy lives in New York City and is one of the great photographers of our era. A young artist in New York and in LA, Max Hooper Schneider, who works with almost the issues of apocalypse and plant life. Here's a Loie Hollowell painting, and this went to conserve, I think it was around 10,000 acres in Central America. And this is a small painting. Again, it's about 22 inches. She's a young artist from Northern California and recently just had her second baby. This is a Thai artist, Rikrit Teravania, and we thought that this piece was really fitting for one of the Art to Acres works. The days of this society is numbered. I really like what Enrique did by, I'm sorry, what Recrit did by not saying are numbered, but is numbered. It really gives you a sense of this impending concern.
Ale,
Yes.
you need to share your screen.
Of course.
So I think you should do it again. It's not a problem. Theo, is that okay?
It's up to him.
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, so today we have myself, Enrique, and Tom Lovejoy speaking. And here's some works that we've worked with for Art into Acres. We have a Jonas Wood landscape, a nice Olivia Musset red painting, a very sweet Cindy Sherman photograph, and Cindy's based in New York, is a very philanthropic artist, one of the great photographers of our time, as I mentioned, Max Hooper Schneider. And this was the Lowy Hollowell that I mentioned that has conserved about 10,000 acres in Central America. A Recrit Terravenia. And as a painter and conservationist, I really enjoy talking to other artists. They love thinking about the wilderness, nature. This is a Richie Johnson called Untitled Escape Collage, and I really liked that he incorporated certain aspects of the landscape wilderness into the collage. And then it conserved land that he then had photographed and is now made into his current artwork. So I like that reciprocity of a place being conserved and then it moving into a future place. This is a wonderful Annika Yee work, who recently won the Hugo Boss Prize at the Guggenheim Museum. And she works quite a lot with synthetic biology. Very, very interesting artist. But in terms of the places that the artworks conserve, we usually focus in the Americas. These are projects that are in process or being researched or have been completed. And some of these projects we've worked on with Enrique, who's on the line today, we get to talk with in a moment. Again, we mostly look at scale, we look at intactness of the forest, and we look at what the biodiversity surveys that have been done in the prior 5 to 10 years to really make sure that the on-the-ground ecology is quite intact. So overall, it's really a pleasure to work with artists and connect them to conserving some of our great landscapes that remain. There's great opportunity in the sense that there are really strong landscapes out there that are in need of conservation. And it's wonderful to partner with our conservation partners, both on the ground and also in matching funds, such as the Weiss Foundation, to do good in the world. Here's a couple places in Peru that I was hoping that Enrique can speak to, because he's deeply involved in these projects. And then a great project that's just unfolding right now in southern Suriname.
And can you show us again the painting? This is paintings that you already sold, or this is paintings that you just get to get some lands? How does it work?
These works have sold. I think these sold in 2018. We've worked to date with about, let's see, 46 artists and then some institutions as well in terms of their carbon neutralization. But I just pulled a handful of those 46 works today for you. I tend to work with a couple works a year. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's more like 12, because it's a very slow process to bring a painting forward. Some of the works sell privately, some are commissions, some sell publicly. It's really for the artist to decide, but I greatly enjoy the process of the long conversations with the artist or with the collector. We have worked with one collector, and that was for the Ed Ruchet piece that's coming up in a moment. And it usually says at the bottom the provenance, where it comes from.
And do you feel that artists are more involved now, or is the same, or?
Oh, I think artists are exceptionally involved. There's a new initiative in New York called Galleries Commit, where the artists and the galleries are coming together to see how they can be more sustainably minded, really to focus on climate issues. And because of climate, they start thinking quite a lot about trees, because trees are our oldest technology of drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. So there's that initiative. There's a great initiative called Art to Zero that's focused on a net zero carbon future. And there's a very well-known gathering called Extinction Rebellion. That's artist-based, that also Eileen Getty has co-founded. So without a doubt, artists are very involved. I'm also very excited to see the different museums coming forward. The Guggenheim just offset the Rem Koolhaus, and they did that with Art to Acres. We conserved some land on their behalf. MoCA is declaring an environmental council coming forward. So all around, the institutions are really signing up for this.
And when did you begin Art in 2 Acres? And do you feel that it's really growing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I began when I was about 22. I started focusing. I knew I wanted to conserve land on behalf of artists. And I spent about 15 years putting together an advisory group of people because it wasn't what I went to school in, and land conservation. And I also knew that I wanted to just focus on learn from the people who are the best in the field. So I got to meet people like Enrique and Tom, who have been great advisors in this process. We started selling work about 4 years ago. And the initiative has brought forward about, like, I think, let's see, through matching funds and the funds of the artwork, about $42 million since then.
Okay. And in which part of the world are you searching lands? You say that the most important is about biodiversity, the number of species. How do you select the lands?
I'm going to stop sharing at this point.
I think it was interesting to share.
It's okay. I want to see Enrique and Tom.
Yeah, there.
Yeah,
okay.
There they are. I think that I really leave that up to the great biodiversity and conservation biologists of our time. So those are not my decisions to make. People like Enrique, we can speak to him a bit, knows exactly where we can serve next. With Art to Acres, I tend to focus on areas that are of immediate need. So we'll focus on a situation that usually has an 18-month window of need. Tom's here too. Fantastic.
Okay. I will just talk 1 minute about wild angels, and after I let you lead the conversation with Enrique and Thomas that we are really happy to have here during the World Animal Day. So wild angels, you're gonna be a part of it because we are launching an app. For the moment, it's a website, and soon it's gonna be an app to gamify the preservation of nature. The idea is to become a wild angel, and thank you, Thomas Lovejoy, to be our godfather. You are already the godfather of biodiversity and now of wild angels. And we're gonna partner with associations like Art in 2 Acres to find the place that people can invest in to preserve wildlife, because it's really important to see that animals are disappearing because of the lack of space and because of the loss of habitat. So I will let you discuss about that. I just remember you that wildangel.org is gonna show reserves all around the world. And LA, you decided to put 4 different reserves. That's gonna happen in 10 days for the next 2 and after 1 month for the one after. Can you talk just 1 minute about this reserve on wild angels?
Well, I'm still learning so much about the app. I think it's really incredible what you spearheaded, Adrian. And I think your world tour is also very educational in itself. So anything that you do that exposes people to some of the benefits and purposes of conservation, I think is really strong. One of the things I like about what you're doing, Adrian, is that you're taking all funds and putting it right to the conservation project, and you're not using the funds for overhead. So that's quite impactful. So I'm here today with Enrique and Tom, Dr. Thomas Lovejoy from the United Nations Foundation, and Enrique Ortiz from Amazon Andes Fund. Thanks for coming, guys.
Happy to be here.
So we're going to speak a little bit, I think our theme today is on biodiversity in the Americas. And Tom, you coined the term biodiversity. So maybe you could start by talking a little bit about what you do and your thoughts on biodiversity now, especially in South America.
So I'm, in the end, I'm focused on protecting, conserving biological diversity, the variety of life on Earth, which makes up functioning ecosystems and is supportive of humans in so many different ways, and is wonderful in itself. But I think the important point to make here is that every formal report that's come out in the last 2 years has been sending a warning signal that we can't keep operating as usual. So in the Americas, you have extraordinary biodiversity, including in Mexico, which is considered part of North America, but going on down through Central America into South America itself. When you look at it from a satellite image, the Amazon is what inevitably pops out and gets your attention, and it should get your attention because it is the single largest repository of diversity on the planet, and it's in trouble. And its ability to provide moisture to every country in South America except Chile is also in trouble. But the Amazon is not the only show in town, and whether you're thinking of biodiversity in the Caribbean islands or the coastal dry forests of Ecuador or the Choco of Colombia, or even the Paramos high in the Andes, or way down into the Llanos, beyond the Llanos into the Pampas of the southern cone. There is absolutely extraordinary biological diversity, and all of it needs help. It's not that some of it isn't protected, it's just, it's not enough. And it gets hammered basically on a daily basis.
Enrique?
Now, if you let me add a couple of things, just to say that the Americas, and particularly the Amazon, is the most biodiverse spot in the planet. It's a big spot, but this is where most of the plants and animal species occur, apart from cultures and indigenous peoples. But in times of COVID, things are not getting any better, and it actually is more a reminder that we need to be concerned about this silent loss of biodiversity, especially considering that many of the solutions, for example, in medicine today, come from biodiversity. So in some ways, this diversity of animals and plants in the planet is what assures our resilience, is in some ways our insurance. So if there is any time in history where this is the most concern, this is right now.
That's really well said. Tom, could you speak a little bit about your work at Camp 41 and the scale aspect for conservation with biodiversity? Because a lot of the conservation work that I fund through Enrique and the work that he does on the ground is very large in scale. I think that speaking to how scale impacts biodiversity, I think would be really smart.
Happy to do that, and just preface it by saying South America has often been called the biodiversity superpower because it has such an important concentration of the planet's biodiversity. So protecting large areas is really important. Understanding what happens when you break habitats up into fragments is really important. And 41 years ago, nobody really understood much about the consequences of habitat fragmentation. So with Brazilian colleagues, I started a giant ecological experiment in the middle of the Amazon, where we actually were able to study forest before it became fragmented and then follow the changes in the forest over time. And just to give you a simple statistic, 100-hectare forest loses half of the forest interior bird species. The ones which will not go out of the forest loses half of those species in less than 15 years. So big is really important. Something on the order of at least 1,000 square kilometers. And happily, a lot of the protected areas, including the ones that Enrique has been working on, are of that kind of scale. But the other thing we need to do is just make sure that there is connections between these different conservation areas of actual forest habitat. So species can move easily as they try and track their required conditions under climate change.
Just adding to Tom's part, protected areas is in some ways is the cornerstone for conservation, and we normally think about protected areas about these national parks or large areas, but also small areas count a lot. Considering that in places like the Andes, the headwaters of the Amazon, for example, because of geological and historical reasons, there have been many pockets that have survived through millions of years, and process of evolution or speciation have happened. So there is an amazing diversity. And pretty much in every corner, you find a new species or some species that lives only in that spot. There are many types of plants and animals, frogs, birds, and you name it, that occur in an area that is probably smaller than the Central Park in New York. So part of the efforts that we all do is, of course, try to protect these large areas that have all these other benefits that are, like, for example, consistent services. But for the sake of biodiversity, even small efforts are very important. I was recently in a panel to review studies, and I was really shocked to see that some of the students that were doing research were reporting a frog that was seen only in one spot, and they went there, and the spot now is full of garbage, or there is no forest. So even those small areas is something that we have to pay attention to.
You know, Enrique brings to mind, you know, one of the things I spend most of my time on is due diligence. And so we look at all the different legal contracts, the accounting, a lot of grant proposals, and there's just a lot of focus before funding a project. And part of that due diligence is travel. And one of the first trips I ever took to Colombia was to up by Santa Marta, up toward the north. And we drove for, you know, conservation trips always involve a lot of bumps on the road. So we drove for probably 9 hours after being in a number of planes. And we end up just soaking wet on the side of this hillside. And they showed me this frog that only lived on that hillside, like you speak of. Existed nowhere else, but it had been, and that's what they call endemic, right? It means that it exists nowhere else. But it had evolved there over, I think, 70 million years. So that's one of the incredible things about the tropics, is that the temperature has been so stable and even that it has allowed this incredible rich evolution of many different species. But like you said, there's certain spots that if you clear cut that area, you will lose that species forever. So it's very important that. And we recently just decided to proceed on a project in Belize. And one of the ways we looked at the intactness or the health of the forest there was we did a deep count on the white-lipped peccary population that was living there. And white-lipped peccaries, you know, are a good sign. I don't know, what's a common name for a white-lipped peccary, like a boar?
Well, in Brazil, I don't know, Tom may know, in Peru, they call it wangana, you know, but it's like a pig in the forest. I don't know how they call it.
It's what the jaguars and such eat. And so if the population, I'm told, is healthy, there's a good sign that the forest also is healthy. And so I think that what we notice is a very sizable, very strong population of white-lipped peccaries there. And then lastly, the last little anecdote I have on species specificity was earlier this year in February, we traveled to central Colombia to visit Monacasillas, which would be a potential last national park for Colombia. Enrique, you and I shared that trip, which was wonderful. And while we were there, a lot of the landscape was a bit burned because they have some burning happening by some of the landowners before the park will be purchased. And we saw 2 massive anacondas just in this little pit.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just these huge animals. I don't know how much they weighed, but what I was surprised is how strong that ecosystem was, even though there was some human incursion, and how strong that ecosystem is going to come back, which is part of the reason that Colombia chose it as a potential site for a national park.
Yeah. Just as a note, anecdotal, wildlife is very resilient, and we keep being surprised actually of some species that we thought that they disappeared completely, and suddenly, we find them, so it always amazes me, these anacondas that we saw, by the way, they were really massive, kind of scary. They were living along this very small creek, with a vegetation of probably no more than 5 meters to each side. And there was this enormous animal who I believe is several dozens of years old, still there, and that was like, wow, that was amazing.
Yeah. Tom, do you mind speaking a little more about your research work in particular with Camp 41? I know we went on it a bit, but in my travels to visit some of Tom's research, incredible people from all over the world have gone to Brazil and see a location that he has worked on now, I think, for 50 years. Everyone from heads of states to presidents to people with their children. And Tom, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the research you've been doing there and how it intercourses with biodiversity as a topic.
So basically, it is a major landscape ecology experiment to try and understand how forests respond to fragmentation, but also to get a notion of just how big a minimum size should be for an Amazon park. And as I mentioned, we think it's at least 1,000 square kilometers. But we get this kind of information through a lot of work, just a lot of work. So we have been studying the birds in those forests for 41 years. We've been following 66,000 individual trees, essentially for 41 years. And that means actually detecting changes in the tree community, changes in the bird community, and primates as well. And I mean, it's a long, long list. It's quite a wonderful place. It's a great place to take people to actually learn about biodiversity and learn about the Amazon and learn about the forest. It's quite fortunate. It has very few mosquitoes, almost none. And in the intact forest, it's essentially, forest primeval. I mean, you probably won't see a jaguar, but the jaguar will see you, and you may well see the jaguar's footprint. And occasionally we have herds of peccaries come through, like we were talking about earlier. And close to my favorite camp, we discovered about a dozen years ago that there was actually a harpy eagle nest. Probably had been there a long time because they're very quiet. And they nest on the top of trees that are higher than the rest of the forest. They are the most powerful raptor in the world. And they feed on monkeys and sloths, mainly. And one of the great things about Camp 41 is I've learned that I don't have to say a whole lot, that the experience of the forest actually is the most effective way to get people to understand the importance. And basically, you can't spend 3 days at Camp 41 without coming away with the understanding that we live on a living planet and we better manage it that way. So, like any scientific enterprise, an awful lot of the work is done by students. They're the only ones who actually have the big blocks of time to devote to things. And so in the course of all of this, we have now passed 800 scientific publications. We have a couple hundred PhDs and master's degrees, at least half of whom are Brazilian. So we're building the next generation of conservationists and scientists in that country. And I eventually came to realize that what a great classroom to teach people. And I suppose the first trip like that was made in January 1989, just after the assassination of Chico Mendes, the head of the rubber tappers in Brazil. And I had with me 3 U.S. senators, Tim Wirth, John Hines, and Al Gore, and the executive editor of the Washington Post, and assorted others. And the executive editor of the Washington Post said it was his epiphany about the environment. And so having had that experience, I began to quite deliberately bring people to see what's going on. And so there's an ever-growing body of alumni, if you want to call it that way, from that project who go out into the larger world and carry the message of biodiversity and conservation.
And just to complement Tom, one of the important details about Camp 41 is the fact that it's not only very rich or biodiverse place, but also the fact that there is so many years of research. And one of the things that there are very few examples in the Amazon as well as in the tropics where you have long-term research going on. It is critical to understand what is happening with populations in time, and that is very unusual. And that's one of the special things about Camp 41. And Tom perhaps has the same experience I had, is that I've been working in the Amazon almost 40 years, and even if I go, every time I go, I see something that leaves me with my mouth open. It's always something new, so it's an endless source of inspiration and amazement, and Camp 41 is one of those spots too.
Yeah, so one of my favorite stories like that is within the last couple of years, I was bringing a new group into Camp 41, and I always make a point of getting into the camp before all the others do so I can welcome them. And I'm going down the trail. It's late in the day. It's sort of half light. And out of the corner of my eye, I see some fluttering. And I think, oh, it must be a morpho butterfly, those brilliant iridescent blue butterflies.
Yes.
And I took another couple steps and I realized, no, that's not flying like a morpho butterfly. So I took a look and it was pale and it was really sort of a floppy flight. So I went over and followed it until it landed on a tree trunk. And it turned out to be the largest moth in South America. It's called the white witch. And it is so poorly known that its caterpillar is still unknown.
Wow. That's incredible. There's a book that goes around the art circles that was written, I think, in 2002 by Elaine Scarry called On Beauty and Being Just. And half of the book, she focuses on a moth. She sees a moth on a stone, catches her eye. And she moves into a conversation on equity. And this thing, when you see something that's really beautiful, it's decentering. It causes you to no longer be in the center of your own thoughts and, ego, but you're just in awe of this other thing. And she saw the beauty from nature as being rather political in that way, because it causes us to notice the other, pay attention to something outside of ourselves. And in a way, it's like the thing of falling in love, where you just want to be close to this other thing because you find it so amazing.
And so the analogy with art and nature is right there.
Yeah, I think so. I got to visit Tom's Camp 41 in 2018, and I had heard ahead of time all these stories, so it was nice to see it in person. But we traveled to Manaus, which is the nearest large city, and I was told before I met Tom that I wasn't given the details, but I heard that in Brazil at the time, that if you clear cut an acre has to stay standing. And so Tom sort of was grandfathered into these plots of land that were 1 acre. And I was told in multiples of 10 acres, 100 acres, but there were these squares of forest that was still standing, surrounded by forest that had been cut. And so part of his research was to see how does scale affect biodiversity that remains in remnants. And it really is an exceptional argument for large-scale conservation and for the connectivity, as Enrique was speaking to. I think that earlier I showed images of 2 projects that Amazon Andes Fund has been supporting in Peru, and they're both very large-scale projects, and one in Colombia. Enrique, do you want to talk a little bit about what you're working on?
Yeah, the one in Colombia is called San Lucas, which is a protected area. It's in the making. Still it hasn't been declared, and work is ongoing. But it's particularly important because Colombia is kind of crisscrossed by a number of cordilleras, the mountain ranges, and there is one that is kind of gets out of a central cordillera. And is in the northwest. It's the most northwestern mountain range. It's a massive, and that one has remained isolated for quite a while, and it's full of rich. Well, it's rich of species, of very unique species. Unfortunately, it's also surrounded by a number of development projects and different types of plans for development plans, and the area is under quite risk. So part of the project that we are working with the government of Colombia, with Parques, with the National Park Service of Colombia, is to do all these necessary studies, which are, for example, consultations, different plans, and also understand what is there in order to have an area that is under protection and is effective. And that's almost 500,000 hectares. So it's quite a large area. It's what would be 1.4 million acres. The other ones in Peru are one is called Tapiche, which is next to indigenous territories. And the interesting and important part is that in this section of the Amazon, there are a number of populations of indigenous peoples who have run away in some ways, or they have been escaping from society because of the historical memory of massacres during the time of the rubber boom, early 1900s. And this area is also contiguous to an area that has been declared to protect, not letting anybody to get into these areas, basically protect these cultures, which are very fragile. So it is not only a very rich biodiversity area, but it's also an area that is also acting as a door to closed door, to protect indigenous peoples. And there is another area also in Cusco, it's called Uruzagua, which is another one important. But all of them have the same pattern, which are very unique type of forests, very unique types of ecosystems that are also in a very critical moment that they need to be protected because there are a number of plants all over. So these are areas that are some of the ones that we're working. We're working, by the way, on a number of them, but those are the ones that we have been directly related with Haley's supports.
That's really fascinating to hear, Enrique. I think one of the things we've been talking about, we talked a bit about biodiversity as a term, but we didn't hear, Tom, how you came up with that term. And I'd love if we could talk a little bit about intactness now that Enrique is talking about connectivity. But Tom, I know you're asked the question a lot, but since it's World Animal Day,
Now we heard the answer.
you got to answer it on World Animal Day.
It's a pretty simple story. So at the time I was in graduate school, there was a lot of interest in what set the number of species in certain kinds of habitats as opposed to other habitats. So the whole idea of species diversity was in the air. And then Ed Wilson and Robert MacArthur published an important paper in a book on the number of species on islands. And that stimulated a lot of people. And it also raised questions about remnant pieces of habitats, essentially habitat islands and larger landscapes. So the whole idea of diversity was sort of part of just the scientific discussion at the time. And there was no term other than just using the word nature that could deal with that, which would talk about the variety of nature. And so 3 of us in 1980 actually used the phrase biological diversity in print. I don't think any of us thought that we were doing something new when we did that. And we certainly, none of us was paying attention to who was first. And one of those was Ed Wilson, famous biologist. And the other was Elliot Norris, who was at the Council on Environmental Quality. And it was only some years later that Elliot announced from the stage of the Natural History Museum in New York that he'd gone back and looked at it all, and I had been the first. So I once got introduced before a talk as the father of biological diversity as a consequence of that history. And I said, no, that's not biologically possible, right? And then it became Godfather.
I like that word, Godfather. I mean, there's a lot of innuendos. I think what's nice about the term first is not so much the hip hip hooray of it, but just it's incredible to mark a moment in time when something happened. You know, that before 1982 there was not that term, and then something shifted. And I think it helps me also to remember how recent conservation is as a field. You know, it is a newer field, and we have great forefathers in conservation, but there's a lot still to learn. I mean, that was part of the reason that I spent so long looking for the right advisors and meeting people. And I think from those travels and from that period of time, you know, people will just mention something under their breath, like something they learned in working on a project, or what to pay attention to. I think Chris Tompkins is someone who mentioned so many things that I jotted down and really continue to practice and pay attention to. I think Jack Dangerman is another person who's really smart in looking at supporting conservation and conservation research, Peggy Delaney is another mentor of mine who is just phenomenal in her thinking and her work. She's done some great conservation in Namibia, in addition to in Montana, in the US. And I think that these moments when they're firsts in anyone's life, you always remember those firsts. Recently, last year, the first artist in the US offset her exhibition. It was at the MCA in Chicago. Her name's Mika Rottenberg. And she Skyped me, and we decided to, rather than buy offsets, we decided to engage drawdown through purchasing one parcel of land. So the trees will forever stand and offset. And that it's just nice, it's a moment. And now artists will start doing that. So I think in that way, firsts are good.
It's great.
Hey, Tom, there is an interesting spin-off of the word biodiversity in Colombia, in Bogota, and I think it's in Bogota. They have started a program called Biodiversities, but not biodiversity of diverse, but cities that are biodiverse. And it's kind of interesting because it's a design of having a city that is also a place for wildlife and a place to learn about wildlife. So anyway, that's for your record. That is one of your name.
Yeah. So actually, the New York Botanical Garden, without using the phrase biological diversity, has actually done that in the city. They've inventoried all the species in Central Park. They have ongoing monitoring and lots of essentially volunteers who engage in that work.
That's good to hear. They do great work there. Enrique, Tom told me a little bit about your early history coming to study through a WWF grant, and growing up in Peru, where you met Russ Mittermeier, who's one of the great conservationists, who actually, I think, got his first internship or some form at CI because of Tom. But do you want to tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to wanting to serve land in the Americas?
Well, I guess I lived through a unusual, but kind of a particular time in Peru, going through guerrillas, Shining Path, and before, through a number of crises of military governments. For a while, I was very lucky to be one of the first students who was able and willing to go to the field. And as Tom was saying before, those that have a time and I guess are a bit masochistic. And I basically had the luck to be the assistant of a number of people who in those years were my gurus, and today are my colleagues. So that was, I guess, one of those pressures in life of actually have shared time in the field, not only through the books or reading their papers. And that story basically, evolved into I guess, I would say the realization that what we need to do is to protect places that you have seen throughout your life, because after I went a few years later, I didn't find them anymore. They were just totally destroyed. And today, I would say safely that I've been involved. Of course, I'm not the only one, but I've been involved in the creation of no less than 15, perhaps 20 million hectares of protected areas throughout the region, including Brazil, including Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia. So I guess my career has been mostly about supporting other institutions, other people to protect the land they feel not only that it's only super rich, but it's also there is an identity. So these days, what I do is mainly to through being in an institution that is funding projects, also with support of you, Haley, and other funders, through the Andes Amazon Fund. What we do is we identify a number of ideas and support those who are pushing them. So working together with indigenous peoples, with governments, with the private sector, with scientists, and also with politicians. So that's kind of a short story of a long path.
It's fascinating. I'm thinking about people watching this and how everyone has their own story forward into ecology and biodiversity conservation, and how important it is to engage in your own way. Like, I think it's a different path for each person. And I know I really like working with metrics. I like working on due diligence reviews. And when Tom and I were speaking earlier this week about this session, one of the things I asked him was, what do we say right now? And one of the things he said to me was that there is a strong urgency to act, but there's incredible opportunity as well to move forward and to do good. And one of the things that I've been focusing on is really permanence. You know, you can do a lot of work on a location, but if you don't have the management set up and quite a lot of different levels of security in terms of title and status of the land, that work can be for nothing. So I spend most of my time researching projects, deciding what to move forward with. And I really like working in scale. Like, I love the study and the backing that Tom's work and the work of the Amazon Biodiversity Center has done, because it backs up why people should support large scale landscapes. I tend to find that if you're conserving 1 acre or 1 square meter, it takes as much footwork as it does, 5 million acres, because you're still doing the same documents and research. I care about each square inch. So that's why I like funding and working with and supporting larger and larger areas, because we have the opportunity currently. There are a number of landscapes that are still very healthy and very much intact. And the more land we can conserve, the better, I believe.
I'm Haley. I would say, even though we read the newspapers and we hear the news and fires in Pantanal, many issues here and there, we have achieved quite a bit of a so far, quite a bit of area has been or is under protection in one way or another. If you act together protected areas with, for example, indigenous territories, we are probably close to 40%. Problem is that the other 60% is under siege, and that's something that we need to pay attention to. But at the same time, I would say the most important challenge right now is to secure land tenure.
What does that mean? What does that mean, Enrique? What is securing land tenure?
Well, it's securing means that we should put aside the land use that will be done in that area. In other words, for example, if you declare, for example, a concession or a forest, let's say a protected area, it is not my worry right now if it is, for example, under a level of management and right away. If you look at the history, for example, of even Yosemite, it took like 20 years to have park guards. So what I'm saying is that what you need to do is first secure this land that is not for something else, but is more for protection of biodiversity or ecosystem services. That's what I mean. So in some cases, you may not achieve in a while the levels of management you want, but it's not always possible. But there are many places where I work in the protection. In the first, it took 10 years, and they are in very good shape. So that's what I meant with that.
Fantastic. Tom, do you have thoughts on this?
So I think the most important thing I can say is to give you a perspective of how much positive change has actually happened over the 50 odd years I've been working in the Amazon. And prefacing it, of course, by saying it is not enough. Definitely. But it shows that amazing things can actually be achieved. And so, when I first arrived in 1965, there was one demarcated indigenous area, the Xingu in Brazil, and one national park, which was Canaima in Venezuela, and that was it. Today, close to 50% of the Amazon is either in some kind of formal protected conservation area or in demarcated indigenous reserves. And that's true of virtually every one of the 8 Amazon countries. It's an amazing achievement. And to give people a sense of scale, the Amazon is roughly equivalent in area to the 48 contiguous United States. So basically, an area equivalent to half of that has been set aside for either indigenous areas or conservation, mostly in the last 30 years. And as Enrique says, it's not enough, but it shows that you can really do a lot.
Wow. I never thought about the Amazon in comparison to the greater 48. I agree, you really can do a lot. And that's good to hear. I think that's a nice note to start to conclude this on. Adrian, do you have any thoughts you want to add?
Could I just jump in with one thing? So the reason that comparison is not obvious to people is because the Amazon is right on the equator. And the way the Mercator projection does maps, it makes it look small, but it's really quite substantial.
It's interesting to hear. Well, it's, you know, when you go into any square meter or a square acre of these forests, there's so much life happening all around you. And I think one of the things with this year, which has been such a different year, there's been a lot of focus on equity and the notion of what is justice. And I think that one of the great things in my mind about conservation is it supports habitat for all things. And, you know, it makes it very clear that the planet is not just for a human experiment, but really to engage all things being able to carry forward in their evolution, however that evolution unfolds. And I think that conservation is really an act of equity in that way. I also think it's rather, as Rick Ridgway said, it's a thing for optimists. You don't do it unless you're an optimist. and it's a thing to engage for others. So I think it's very benevolent. You know, you do it to give forward. This summer, I was working all summer on some different due diligence documents for conserved areas that I have yet to ever be to. And so I decided to go camping for a weekend, and I drove north in California up the coast. And I came upon a little reserve just perched on a hillside. And it was the Lady Bird Johnson Reserve. And in the 50s, it was a bunch of redwoods. It was clear cut. And she came along and decided to conserve just that clear-cut land. And now the new redwoods look as though they've always been there. But I loved that foresight of optimism moving forward and the sense of equity. She said, you know, even though this land is not aesthetic, it's not attractive, and it's almost dead, this land is worth taking care of.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And every person has a role. You know, we all can do something about it.
LA, you have 1 minute for each of you to conclude, and after we're gonna go in Colombia with O2 Reserve, and we will discover what they are doing in Colombia. So I let you conclude, each one of you, for 1 minute, and thank you for this hour about the Americas.
Thank you, Adrian. Well, I'll hand it over to Tom to begin.
Well, I think in the end, we have to think of a vision of a world in which humanity's aspiration is embedded in nature, and Wild Angels is a great way to go in that direction.
Enrique?
Yeah, well, I would like to link all what we are discussing with the concept of arts and inspiration. Nature is an inspiration for its own sake. But we all have a responsibility in this, and with our choices, we can make a difference. That's for every individual.
I second what both Enrique and Tom said, and I'd like to underline what Tom said in regards to Wild Angels. I think that's an app that can really make a difference for all living things. It can come forward and take care of of all our great biodiversity because it takes care of habitat. So the Wild Angels project and initiative really looks at protecting the very ground that all of these animals live on. And without that terrestrial surface or without that ocean floor, life can't grow on top of it. So I think it's a fantastic project. I love talking about it today, which is why World Animal Day. And this notion that everyone can come together, conserve a square meter of ground, and just do that for €1, I think is incredible. It's a very benevolent project because to take care of our animals really is to take care of the web of life. And we don't exist without the web of life. We're just one link in that web. So it's such a positive thing to look after the bigger picture. I want to thank Tom and I want to thank Enrique for this time today. It's really been a pleasure to speak with two of my mentors and two of the people who I look up to with such incredible awe for their conservation careers, for what they've given to the planet and what they've given to so many young minds who are coming forward in the world and learning and in school and such. So thank you to both of you today. It's a great way to spend a Saturday. Back to you.
Thank you. And please come back whenever you want on the show. I will be glad to organize for you, even with some other scientists or some little films or photos. I think what you are doing is really important and that everybody should know about your work and about art into acres also, because I think this is amazing what you are doing all together. So please come back whenever you want. Thank you for this hour. It was
Be delighted.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll let you leave the studio and we are launching an hour about O2 and Colombia. And thank you, Ale, thank you, Enrique, thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Art into Acres. And
thank you, Adrian.
Your work about science.
Bientôt.
Really great. Thank you. Bye-bye. See you.
See you there.
Hola, yo soy Toya Montoya, cofundadora de O2 Reserve. Es un honor estar aquí reunidos para trabajar en conjunto por el bienestar de nuestra madre tierra. Con mucho orgullo quiero presentarles uno de los países más biodiversos del mundo, un territorio lleno de vida, de color, de alegría y de esperanza. Hoy distintas voces latinoamericanas se suman a este esfuerzo global por conservar y proteger nuestros ecosistemas.
Bueno, estoy en el delta del Río Grande de la Magdalena, en la Ciénaga Grande. Esto es Gaia. Esto es un lugar importante en Gaia. Nosotros aquí les decimos Gaira.
Ouais, arrête de mettre ton...
Cumbia.
ton truc.
Es una tierra del olvido, la llamé yo en algún disco.
Ah, là, c'est parfait, mais en plus...
pero es una cultura anfibia. Es una cultura que ha vivido históricamente en un intrincado sistema de ríos y de ciénagas y de mosquitos que me están picando. De ríos y de ciénagas que tienen que ver con el Río Grande de la Magdalena, con la ciénaga de Zapatosa, la depresión momposina, ahí esa isla donde está la ciudad de Mompox, tiene que ver con las ciénagas de Lorica, con el San Jorge, tiene que ver con el río Sinú y tiene que ver con las culturas originales de donde heredamos gran parte de nuestra música, de nuestros patrones percutivos, de una alegría de cantarle a la vida, de cantarle al cielo, de cantarle a Gaia, una relación con Gaia histórica que hemos perdido, hemos olvidado. Y mi llamado es a recobrarlo, a recobrar nuestra vida en Gaia. a recobrar nuestra relación íntima con un territorio que nos lo ha dado todo, nos dio el pescado, nos ha dado la mejor música, pero sobre todo nos ha dado la mejor gente. Los felicito por lo que hacen, les deseo todo lo mejor. Y desde esta Gaia, desde esta desembocadura del Río Grande de la Magdalena, desde su delta, les mando un fuerte abrazo a todos y que viva Gaia.
En estos tiempos en que los ecosistemas respiran y entendemos que la vida como la conocemos en el planeta pasa por un momento crucial, vale la pena buscar en nuestra historia las formas de habitar el mundo que puedan devolvernos el equilibrio. Llegado el momento de presentar al público mi 14º álbum de estudio, quiero llevarlos a un mundo mágico perdido en nuestra memoria.
Para contar la historia de Cumbiana hay que empezar por el origen. Es lo que menos se conoce de la historia musical del territorio de la cumbia. De lo que en las crónicas de India se llamó el país de los pocabuyes o la nación chimilla. Sobre esa base empezamos a trabajar sonidos modernos, pero apegados a esos patrones. Es rescatar un cumbiero que hay ahí en el fondo. Hay un cumbiero, ahí hay un cumbiero. La Ciénaga Grande se encuentra con Doñana, es Colombia y España. Pero los secretos de los dos no los presto ni los vendo. Y los recuerdos de tu amor, yo me los llevo muy adentro.
Carlos siempre ha defendido es lo indio del vallenato.
Faltaba la palabra que hablara de un territorio que cuenta una historia. Ese territorio yo lo llamo Cumbiana. No se puede entender a Colombia sin pensar la relación entre los ríos y la gente que los habita. Hicimos una carretera sobre un delta y cometimos un crimen terrible. Las comunidades de las culturas anfibias son tierras del olvido, parecen invisibles, no los vemos.
Un día de mi vida es pescando. Mi familia, todos somos pescadores.
De 10 años me puse a trabajar con el viejo cuando eso existía pescado, que era bastante pescado. Yo me iba con él.
Es importante empezar a entender que ellos son la última huella de una cultura que vivió sobre el agua y de la que heredamos una música extraordinaria que hoy es el símbolo musical de Colombia, se llama la cumbia. Te amo, diré, te espero, ¿y tú qué dirás? Y es que contigo la vida tiene que ser de verdad, tiene que sentirse lindo, ser en tu historia el galán y susurrarte al oído cuando te vuelva a encontrar. Mírame, quéreme, sentate conmigo y contame tus penas, cumbiana, tus sueños sublimes,
Cumbiana, música del cielo, del agua y de la tierra.
Bueno, mi nombre es Israel Mesa Londoño, hago parte de la ciudad de Medellín, Colombia. La invitación es a que conozcamos qué es O2 Reserve y por qué su energía y su vibración ha atraído a tantas personas a involucrarse en el proyecto, en gestar iniciativas que le permitan su viabilidad y su expansión en el mercado. Nosotros ofrecemos una herramienta muy dinámica que nos permite adaptarnos a cualquier proceso de la economía actual. Nos permite entrar a revisar esos procesos de las empresas, a chequear esos productos y a crearles una ruta hacia la sostenibilidad a través de la conservación de metros cuadrados de bosque húmedo tropical. Nuestros bosques están ubicados en una región muy importante de Colombia, se llama el Magdalena Medio. El Magdalena Medio es una región muy importante porque está compuesta de muchísimos biomas, de distintas formas de bosques que permiten el nacimiento y la reproducción de distintas formas de vida, desde fauna, desde flora, desde cultura. Hemos encontrado un montón de cosas que nos enamoran realmente de esta región y que nos dirigen hacia protegerla, que nos enseñan a que conocer es la mejor herramienta para proteger, para conservar, para disfrutar, para conectar. Así que hemos estudiado estos territorios, nos hemos conectado con ellos, hemos aprendido de cuál es su pasado, de cuál es su presente e incluso de cuáles son los planes que hay en ellos a futuro para intervenir desde el conocimiento y aportar a la verdadera gestión de procesos que permitan la existencia de su fauna, de su flora, de su vida, de su naturaleza. En O2 Reserve conservamos metros cuadrados por cualquier actividad comercial de tu empresa. Te permitimos como persona natural ingresar a la comunidad y aportar desde tu conocimiento, desde tu voluntad, a crear esa dinámica que nos permita vivir día a día, intervenir hábitos, cambiar nuestra forma de pensar, de ser y empezar a apreciar la naturaleza desde un punto de vista que nos lleve a verdaderamente poder fluir y poder estar en la vida compartiendo desde los deportes, desde la alimentación, desde las meditaciones, desde la música, en espacios naturales y sanos. Así que queremos crear el mundo que queremos habitar, así que te invitamos a proteger metros cuadrados con nosotros y a que entiendas por qué desde 1 metro cuadrado estamos logrando un impacto totalmente atractivo, totalmente valioso. Es un impacto donde puede caber desde un arroyo de agua, donde puede caber el nacimiento de un árbol, donde puede suceder infinidad de cosas como siempre ha sido en la naturaleza. Así que la invitación es a que en serio percibamos y entendamos por qué 1 metro cuadrado importa. 1 metro cuadrado no lo medimos por superficie, lo medimos por volumen. En el volumen caben infinitas formas de vida, de energía, de salud, de abundancia, de fauna, de flora, de sucesos. Infinitas cosas suceden en 1 metro cuadrado. Así que la invitación es: entiende por qué 1 metro cuadrado importa, únete y aporta tu metro cuadrado, porque 1 meter matters.
Nuestra creatividad está al servicio de la naturaleza. Circulamos libremente las ideas en busca de procesos que conlleven a la creación de hábitos sostenibles. Somos una plataforma de conservación del medio ambiente a través de la protección de metros cuadrados de bosque húmedo tropical. Intervenimos productos, servicios y hábitos cotidianos para transformarlos en sostenibles. Cuando logremos nuestro cometido, la conservación no será más una actividad proactiva y necesaria. Será orgánica e intrínseca a nuestra propia existencia.
Para mí, 1 metro cuadrado de bosque conservado importa y mucho, porque los bosques ayudan a regular nuestro clima, ayudan a prevenir la erosión de nuestra tierra, son el hogar de muchísimas poblaciones indígenas, son una farmacia, nuestra farmacia. Más del 25% de los medicamentos vienen de plantas de los bosques, porque muchos de los productos que nosotros consumimos hoy día se originan en las selvas tropicales. Por estas y muchas más razones, debemos conservar nuestros bosques.
Hola, yo soy Natalia Reyes. 1 metro cuadrado de bosque conservado importa porque lo necesitamos. Porque necesitamos de los bosques para respirar, para vivir, porque llevamos muchos años maltratándolos, deforestando y ahora creemos que debemos salvarlos. Es lo mínimo que podemos hacer. Si cada ser humano adoptara 1 metro cuadrado de bosque, podríamos cambiar el rumbo de la historia y compensar un poco todo el daño que le hemos hecho a la madre naturaleza.
Para mí, 1 metro cuadrado de bosque conservado importa porque los bosques son el hogar del 80% de la biodiversidad mundial de plantas y animales. No solo eso, los bosques son indispensables para la vida porque regulan el ciclo del agua, recogen y almacenan el agua, ayudan a evitar las inundaciones y, ojo, los bosques reducen los efectos del cambio climático producido por el hombre. Para mí, 1 metro cuadrado es una gran diferencia.
Hola. Mi nombre es María Posada y soy abogada ambiental y me dedico a la conservación de metros cuadrados de naturaleza en Colombia, especialmente en un lugar muy especial, único, de los más biodiversos del mundo, y es el Magdalena Medio colombiano. En él se encuentra el bosque húmedo tropical kárstico, donde habitan pumas, jaguares, lémures, dantas, panteras, donde hay ceibas, piñones de oreja, árboles caobas, y es un bosque muy denso, muy fértil y tiene la fauna y la flora más biodiversa del mundo. Lastimosamente, la vocación del Magdalena Medio ha sido la minería y la ganadería, y hoy el lugar, que son casi 350 millones de hectáreas, más del 60% está deforestado. Entonces, desde ABOUT, una empresa aliada, buscamos la conservación de esta zona, cogiendo esos lunares de bosque húmedo tropical kárstico y conectándolos con la serranía de San Lucas, con el Medio Oriente, el Oriente Antioqueño y Boyacá, y tratando de hacer un corredor para la fauna y la flora del lugar. El corredor cáustico viene desde la punta de Argentina y comunica hasta Canadá. Es una falla tectónica, uno de las zonas más antiguas del mundo. El Magdalena Medio pertenece al Pleistoceno y es un lugar de suma importancia para el medio ambiente y para la existencia de nosotros como humanidad y la subsistencia de este ecosistema actual que tenemos hoy en día. ¿Cómo opera esta alianza en el Magdalena Medio con ABOUT? Nosotros buscamos territorios, predios de ganaderos, campesinos, títulos legítimos sobre tierras que tengan manchas de conservación. Revisamos su ficha catastral, su título, la legalidad del predio, revisamos la importancia de la fauna y la flora de ese espacio, cómo se encuentra, y desde ahí empezamos a generar una gestión ambiental a la biodiversidad y buscamos que esos territorios se vuelvan reservas naturales de la sociedad civil. De esa manera vinculamos al Estado, a parques naturales, a Corantioquia, a Cornare, a trabajar con nosotros para la protección del Magdalena Medio. Al ser reserva natural de la sociedad civil, tú grabas ese terreno por 30 años y te comprometes a no talarlo, a no deforestarlo y que empiece a llegar la flora del lugar y a crear unos corredores de conectividad de fauna y flora. Desde ABOUT lo que hacemos es empezar a transar en ese espacio en el mercado, poniéndole una tarifa, un costo a ese metro cuadrado y venderlo a organizaciones internacionales, empresas privadas que buscan compensar su impacto ambiental y mitigar su huella ecológica, logrando así que la conservación ambiental sea un activo, sea una nueva vocación para el Magdalena Medio y logremos alcanzar esa protección y esa restauración de esa tierra y buscar a un futuro que ya no sean tierras deforestadas, sino caminos para la fauna y flora. Actualmente somos un equipo multidisciplinario donde involucramos al Estado, empresas privadas, ingenieros ambientales altamente capaces, diseñadores, fotógrafos, biólogos, ABOUT, MISER, todos en son de la conservación ambiental. El equipo turístico del Magdalena Medio, buscando como finalidad la conservación de metros cuadrados. Los mineros han puesto en algunas zonas hasta el 70% en conservación en algunos títulos. Hay una conciencia de proteger la naturaleza. No digo que ya estemos a un nivel de evolución donde le demos esa prioridad a la naturaleza y dejemos de verla como recurso y empecemos a verla como el hogar que habitamos, pero sí hay una conciencia de conservación de los seres humanos que habitamos actualmente y se ha empezado a despertar esa chispita de cambio y de protección. Por eso, el hecho de integrar las compensaciones voluntarias en el mercado por medio de la compra de gestión de metros cuadrados, gracias a ABOUT, ha generado que el bosque húmedo tropical, desde su biodiversidad, desde su observación cualitativa, tenga un valor económico y se pueda transar en el medio ambiente. Y lo hace la actividad que está haciendo ABOUT, algo innovador que busca la protección y el beneficio de la naturaleza. Yo creo que por eso estamos hoy en este foro, estamos hablando de qué se puede hacer para proteger al medio ambiente, a la Pacha, a Gaia, y juntos todos hoy aquí reunidos con un mismo foco, una misma visión, trabajando en equipo en diversas partes del mundo, podemos lograr un cambio. Invito a que las organizaciones internacionales inviertan en metros cuadrados de conservación en el Magdalena Medio. Revisen que las entidades que reciben los dineros realmente ejecuten de manera adecuada estos fondos. Invito a que las empresas privadas colombianas le metan la ficha a la conservación del Magdalena Medio. Es un lugar único en el mundo, solo comparable con el río Mekong en Vietnam, y es una zona importantísima de un valor intangible para la sociedad humana, para el planeta Tierra. Es uno de los corazones del mundo. Sus aguas, sus cuencas hídricas, sus retiros, sus saludes, sus montañas, sus cavernas, sus zonas arqueológicas. Empiecen a observar qué tiene el Magdalena Medio y van a ver que se van a descrestar. Los invito a invertir en el Magdalena Medio por medio de ABOUT, a comprar gestión de metros cuadrados y a lograr ese sueño de conectividad entre la serranía de San Lucas, el oriente antioqueño y Boyacá, y darle un camino al jaguar, que es el pico de un ecosistema de fauna mundial. Donde hay jaguar, nos habla de un medio ambiente sano, y el medio ambiente del Magdalena Medio es su casa y es su hogar. Entonces los invito a cuidar. Muchas gracias.
Un gran reto implica una gran unión. Por eso hoy voces latinas influyentes de distintos países pertenecientes al corredor del jaguar alzan su voz para agradecer los esfuerzos por proteger esta especie y agradecer a nuestra madre tierra por su infinita generosidad.
Mi agradecimiento es para todas las mujeres y todos los hombres que han dedicado su vida, su energía, su tiempo a proteger la madre naturaleza, a transmitirnos su sabiduría infinita y a recordarnos que estamos hechos de ella, que ella nos habita y que por lo tanto es nuestra responsabilidad habitarla con respeto y honrándola todos los días. Gracias. Gracias por su enorme labor, por su valentía, por sus enseñanzas. Gracias.
Hola, soy Steffi Stegmar y en nombre de todo mi país queremos agradecer a la Madre Tierra, porque su nombre lo dice todo, es nuestra madre, es el lugar donde ella nos alberga y nos nutre con sus infinitas riquezas, animales, plantas, árboles, el oxígeno que respiramos hasta el agua que bebemos. No permitamos más que le hagan daño a nuestra Madre Tierra. Luchemos, unamos nuestras fuerzas y nuestras voces para seguir conservándola y haciéndola que la respeten. Ella nos da una gran enseñanza. Hagamos esto por ella. No dejemos que muera nuestra madre.
Hola, soy Juan Pablo Medina. Hoy me uno a la voluntad de todos los aquí reunidos para celebrar todas las formas de vida en nuestro planeta. Hoy quiero agradecerle a la Madre Tierra por permitirnos vivir en ella y aún después de tanto maltrato siga siendo generosa y amorosa con todos los que la habitamos. Gracias por enseñarnos con tus ciclos la importancia de ser pacientes y de vivir en equilibrio y balance con todo y todos los que nos rodean.
Hola, yo soy Paulina Dávila y para mí conservar 1 metro cuadrado de bosque importa cuando entendemos la complejidad de los ecosistemas de nuestro planeta, la interacción y dependencia entre especies y el perfecto equilibrio que hay para que exista la vida tal y como la conocemos. Si cada uno de nosotros conserváramos 1 metro cuadrado de bosque, haríamos una gran diferencia.
Mi agradecimiento con la Madre Tierra es por su infinita abundancia, por su sabiduría y por su incomparable compasión con la humanidad. Esa humanidad que la destruye, esa humanidad que la explota indiscriminadamente, que no la respeta ni la valora lo suficiente. Gracias, Madre Naturaleza, por regalarnos la oportunidad todos los días de seguir disfrutando de la majestuosidad de tus ríos, de tus montañas, de tus bosques, de tus animales, de tus olores, de tus sabores. Gracias por recordarnos todos los días la importancia de coexistir. Así muchas personas no entiendan esta palabra. Por ti seguiré alzando mi voz todos los días sin miedo para respetarte, honrarte y amarte cada día más.
Mi nombre es Mariana Gutiérrez. Soy ingeniera forestal, estudiante de la maestría en bosques y conservación ambiental de la Universidad Nacional de Colombia, sede Medellín. Los ríos son como las venas de la tierra. A través de ellos fluye energía, fluye materia, y los ríos son los que conectan territorios distantes, regiones muy apartadas. A través de los ríos fluye la vida. Donde quiera que ellos vayan, llevan vida, llevan diversidad de formas de vida. Colombia es un país muy rico en fuentes hídricas y la historia del origen de esas fuentes hídricas es una historia apasionante, es una historia muy bonita. Colombia tiene un lugar al que le llamamos el macizo colombiano y es este lugar donde se divide la cordillera de los Andes en 3 cordilleras, la occidental, la central y la oriental. Este macizo colombiano es una formación montañosa que la originaron fuerzas tectónicas y al generar estas formaciones montañosas, estas geoformas, afloraron fuentes hídricas muy importantes, tanto en términos ecológicos como culturales. Una de estas fuentes hídricas es el río Patía. El río Patía drena hacia el occidente, cruza las planicies del Chocó geográfico y desemboca en el Océano Pacífico. De este macizo colombiano, que es una estrella fluvial, también afloran otros 2 ríos pertenecientes a la cuenca del Amazonas, el río Caquetá y el río Putumayo. Estos ríos drenan hacia el oriente y pasan por las planicies amazónicas, creando por su paso una gran cantidad de ecosistemas muy complejos y dinámicos y que hacen parte de los biorritmos de las comunidades indígenas de la Amazonía. Este macizo colombiano también es el lugar donde afloran dos ríos muy importantes para nuestro país. Son el río Cauca y Magdalena. Estos dos ríos son ríos hermanos. Ambos drenan hacia el norte y recorren aproximadamente 1.500 kilómetros. Corren hacia el norte juntos, pero cada uno en su propio valle interandino. Más adelante en el norte, en la depresión Mopocina, se vuelven a encontrar y siguen su trayecto juntos hasta la desembocadura en Barranquilla, en el Mar Caribe. El río Cauca está confinado por las cordilleras occidental y central, y el río Magdalena por la cordillera central y oriental. Este paisaje, como nosotros lo conocemos, no ha sido así desde siempre. Este paisaje hace más de 20 millones de años no era así. Resulta que lo que nosotros conocemos como las planicies de la Amazonía y la Orinoquía antes estaban pegados a lo que conocemos como el Valle del Magdalena porque no existía la cordillera oriental. Hace aproximadamente 10 millones de años la cordillera oriental emerge y separa lo que hoy conocemos como Magdalena y Amazonía y Orinoquía. La flora y la fauna que existía en ese lugar que hoy conocemos como Magdalena quedó aislada de su flora, de su región de origen, de su región biogeográfica de origen o su región ancestral. Esto hace que el Magdalena tenga unas condiciones ecológicas muy particulares. Esto hace que la flora y la fauna tenga un alto grado de endemismo por tener una barrera geográfica como lo son las cordilleras en su costado oriente y su costado occidente. La dinámica biogeográfica que tiene el Magdalena, ahora acotándonos un poco al Magdalena medio, esa dinámica geográfica es muy compleja porque al ser un valle ancho de fondo plano, confinado por un par de cordilleras, como lo son la cordillera central y occidental, hace que la migración y el movimiento de las especies sea muy dinámico. Por ejemplo, me explico, al levantarse las cordilleras de los Andes en Colombia, entonces es la cordillera occidental, central y oriental, esas cordilleras sirvieron como corredores de migración de especies, tanto de Centroamérica como de Suramérica, porque las especies están adaptadas, por ejemplo, a una temperatura. Entonces, las especies extratropicales o subtropicales que están adaptadas a unas épocas de frío, unas estaciones de frío, empezaron a migrar por las montañas, que era la condición más fría que había en el trópico. Entonces, al terminarse de levantar el istmo de Panamá y las cordilleras de aquí de este país, las especies empezaron a migrar y empezaron con las fluctuaciones naturales del clima, empezaron a migrar a los valles interandinos y a las partes de las altas montañas. Entonces, esto hace que en el Valle del Magdalena, especialmente en el Valle del Magdalena Medio, haya una mixtura de especies de un origen biogeográfico muy diverso. Y esto permite que se estructuren ecosistemas muy complejos que son muy valiosos, que los cuidemos y los conservemos. Por ejemplo, el Valle del Magdalena Medio tiene al norte la serranía de San Lucas y al oriente las serranías de los Yariguíes, entre otras, y las serranías son montañas bajas que han servido como refugio de muchas especies después de las fluctuaciones climáticas naturales que ha sufrido el planeta Tierra, ¿cierto? Entonces, en este Valle del Magdalena Medio podemos encontrar ecosistemas muy singulares, muy particulares, como lo son en las estribaciones de las cordilleras, en los piedemontes, unos complejos de montañas donde aún todavía se conservan bosques maduros, no pristinos, pero sí bosques maduros con árboles de buen porte. También a medida que ascendemos de las cordilleras y acercándonos más como al lecho del río Magdalena, empezamos a encontrar unos lomeríos, son montañas que no superan ninguna su tamaño medio, y a medida que nos acercamos mucho más al lecho del río Magdalena encontramos las llanuras aluviales y las planicies aluviales. Resulta que estas geoformas que existen en este valle del Magdalena Medio tienen una diversidad de ecosistemas muy valiosos. Por mencionar el más afectado por el cambio del uso de la tierra y por la deforestación, son los bosques de las tierras bajas. Digamos que en el Magdalena Medio la colonización que ha actuado de una manera más fuerte ha sido lo que llaman colonización por aluvión, que es que a partir del río se empieza a colonizar hacia los entornos del río. Entonces las partes más afectadas por los cambios de uso de la tierra y la deforestación son las más cercanas al río. Entonces entre ellas están los bosques de tierras bajas, tanto inundables como de tierra firme, y también están las ciénagas y los humedales. Las ciénagas y los humedales son ecosistemas muy frágiles porque su condición permanente de inundación disminuyen la tasa de descomposición de la materia orgánica, son los árboles botan hojas, las plantas herbáceas y arbustivas botan sus hojas, y cuando mueren queda toda la biomasa de sus raíces debajo del suelo, y cuando este suelo se mantiene inundado la tasa de descomposición es muy baja, entonces el carbono que está dentro de la biomasa, o sea dentro de los cuerpos de las plantas y animales, se acumula en el suelo. Entonces los humedales son un reservorio de carbono muy importante. Al realizar actividades de minería o actividades de ganadería y agricultura, es necesario secar estos humedales. Los humedales es todo ese carbono que estaba acumulado en el suelo, se libera a la atmósfera. Entonces los humedales pasarían de ser un sumidero de carbono a ser un emisor de carbono, y todos sabemos que el CO2 es uno de los gases de efecto invernadero importantes. Además, por la misma naturaleza de los humedales emiten metano, y al secar los humedales, la emisión de metano podría dispararse muchísimo más. Estos son argumentos a favor de la conservación de los ecosistemas del Magdalena Medio. Y de lo importante que es conservar estos ecosistemas, no solo por su ubicación geográfica tan especial, no solo por su historia biogeográfica, sino por los servicios ecosistémicos que nos están brindando a nosotros como humanidad, ya sean servicios ecosistémicos de apoyo, de regulación hídrica, y otro tipo de servicios ecosistémicos que también nos prestan. Los ecosistemas del Magdalena Medio albergan más de 4.000 especies de plantas, albergan más de 130 especies de aves, más de 130 especies de mamíferos, los reptiles son muy diversos también, pero la mala noticia es que muchos de estas especies están en algún grado de amenaza. Por ejemplo, entre los mamíferos, el jaguar, el tití gris, el mono araña café, el manatí, el pecarí, son especies que por la destrucción de su hábitat se han visto amenazadas, han disminuido mucho sus poblaciones y se encuentran todas ellas en algún grado de amenaza. De aves, por ejemplo, el tití gris es una especie endémica y se encuentra amenazada. De aves hay como 4 especies endémicas, de las cuales 2 de ellas se encuentran amenazadas. especies de árboles y de plantas en general se encuentran amenazadas, por ejemplo, el carrá, los caobos, los cedros, se encuentran amenazados el cagüí, y son especies de maderas preciosas, son especies de una alta utilidad para las comunidades que por la tala indiscriminada y por la destrucción del hábitat también se encuentran en un estado de amenaza. Digamos que estas cifras para muchos son solo cifras, pero no se trata de conservar especies individuales como si fueran objetos, sino que se trata de conservar el proceso que cumplen y la función que cumplen estas especies en los ecosistemas. Entonces, digamos que los planes de conservación no pueden ser individualizados por especie. Es mejor pensar en conservar los hábitats de todas las especies y que ellas en su naturaleza funcionen de una manera adecuada y fluida y natural, ¿cierto? Entonces la invitación es a que pensemos en utopías, pensemos en cosas que a la mayoría de la gente les parece imposible, como lo es conservar en el Magdalena Medio. El Magdalena Medio es un punto geoestratégico y tiene una importancia ecológica, política y cultural muy fuerte. Por esto, las actividades extractivistas son las que más afectan estos ecosistemas. Entonces, pensar en que un uso de la tierra puede ser la conservación es una utopía, pero es una utopía en que cada día lo vemos más probable. Y para eso es importante trabajar en que la conservación se tenga en cuenta como otros usos de la tierra, como lo son la ganadería, como lo son la agricultura y como lo son la minería. Que la conservación se tenga en cuenta como un uso de la tierra eficiente y con gente, que la gente no se tenga que ir porque va a haber conservación, no, que la gente aprenda a vivir conservando y desde la ciencia, desde la academia, desde el conocimiento tradicional, integrar estos aprendizajes que como humanidad y como comunidad hemos construido y lograr la conservación en el Magdalena Medio. Yo creo que llegó el momento de pensar entre todos y juntos cómo ayudar a la situación del planeta Tierra, porque si vemos al planeta Tierra como un organismo vivo y si vemos nuestro papel en el funcionamiento de ese organismo vivo, vamos a detectar que tenemos algo por hacer, que nos falta algo por hacer, pero solo lo podemos lograr actuando juntos, actuando de manera orgánica entre diferentes actividades que hacemos los seres humanos. Es una sostenibilidad ambiental, es una sostenibilidad económica, es una sostenibilidad cultural. Pienso que solo así podríamos encontrar, ayudar a estos ecosistemas y ayudar al planeta. Gracias como a la existencia, tenemos la capacidad de mirarnos hacia adentro, ¿cierto? Tenemos la capacidad de callar un poco el ruido de afuera y concentrarnos en lo que estamos sintiendo adentro. Y al hacer eso nos damos cuenta de que tenemos tanta influencia en nuestro universo cercano que las acciones individuales van a empezar a generar cambios. Entonces, si nos concentramos como en nuestra espiritualidad un poco, vamos a empezar a descubrir cuál es nuestro papel y cómo podemos ayudar a ese entorno cercano. Y si eso lo hacemos cada uno de nosotros, ese entorno cercano va a ser todo el planeta y va a ser el universo. Hay personas y hay seres como en esta generación o en esta época de la humanidad que tienen muchos mensajes importantes para nosotros y que han reconocido su papel en la humanidad y que están dispuestos a compartir todos sus saberes para que nosotros los escuchemos y nos inspiremos a mirarnos por dentro, a mirar al otro como parte de nosotros también.
In modern time, some people really showing concern about animal rights. This is very, very encouraging. If our world, only human being, other animal disappear, then we really will feel very lonely. So these animals are something like the ornament of our world, including birds, fish, and including flying, different fly, different color, very beautiful. So now we too much exploit animals. And then I really feel like big animal farm. So these are because environmentally also very harmful. In America, there are some big beef farm. I think it's too serious. So meantime, everybody become vegetarian. That also impractical, especially those cold climate, like northern Tibet and Mongolia. Through generations, their life depend on animal. But meantime, like India, there are a lot of vegetable there. So in India, already vegetarianism very good. So now since last few years, I appeal our big monastic institution and also some school. Their community kitchen should serve vegetarian food. So we make a little contribution. So it is very useful to promote vegetarianism. And so we should pay more attention about develop some more vegetable like that.
Hola, mi nombre es María Fernanda Yepes, soy colombiana, actriz y habitante de este planeta. Hoy me uno a ABOUT Reserve y a Gaia World Tour en este rezo a la tierra, en este rezo a nuestra Pachamama, en estos momentos donde nuestra pobre madre está siendo tan golpeada, pero donde habemos tantos que la queremos, que le rezamos, que le hablamos, que le oramos, que la celebramos cada día. Y yo desde aquí, desde este lugar tan mágico y tan maravilloso, los quiero invitar a que conozcan nuestro proyecto de Casa Felina. Es una biblioteca de saberes ancestrales donde queremos rescatar el trabajo de las manos, el trabajo de los artesanos. Queremos cuidar a nuestro rey de las selvas, el jaguar, que no solo es importante que lo cuidemos como especie, sino también que cuidemos su casita como ser de medicina y conocimiento. Él durante muchos años ha cuidado del hombre y yo creo que llegó el momento en que nosotros cuidemos de él. Por eso me uno a este rezo, me uno al rezo por la Pachamama, por la tierra, por los animales, por el agua, por las flores, por el campo, por los ríos, por la vida. Madre, hoy te acariciamos con nuestros pies descalzos danzando al ritmo de tu pulso. Nosotros, los que estamos escuchándote, los que estamos de pie, levantamos este rezo de agradecimiento a ti que siempre nos das vida. A ti que nos permites habitarte. Gracias. Bendecimos tus lluvias que refrescan la tierra, que calman la sed de las selvas y apagan los fuegos de la ambición. Y a las semillas que se fecundan en tu vientre para darnos el alimento. Gracias por tus paisajes que inspiran nuestro espíritu cada día. Hoy reconocemos que somos uno con vos. Que gracias a tu orden estamos vivos. Tennos paciencia. Estamos intentando recordar cómo habitarte. Madre Tierra, enséñanos a vivir en paz. Siembra los corazones del hombre con tu sabiduría y que sean tus lluvias las que nos despierten de esta ilusión humana. Se nos ajuste la percepción para ver lo que descansa más allá de las formas. Enséñanos a no tomar más de lo que necesitamos, ya que todo es vida, y que solo con tu permiso se nos permite cosechar. Perdónanos por saquearte las entrañas. Apenas estamos empezando a recordar que somos un solo tejido. Hoy, nosotros sentimos el dolor que te genera la ambición del hombre. Ambición que solo se alimenta del dolor de sentirnos separados de ti. Hoy, queremos reconocer que tenemos mucho que aprender de ti, porque tus leyes son nuestras leyes. El único derecho que tenemos es el de amar. No existen fronteras entre nosotros. No hay nada que defender. Somos un solo tejido con el resto del universo. En este rezo te ofrendamos todas nuestras pertenencias, porque ya vimos que al final todo es tuyo. Por eso nos liberamos de todo apego. Ya estamos completos con una madre tan abundante. El sentido de carencia es solo nuestra ilusión. Hoy, alzamos este rezo para que todos los habitantes de este planeta despierten y se sientan un solo tejido. Con este rezo ofrecemos nuestros corazones para construir juntos una cultura de paz. Gracias, Madre Tierra.
Chamamamu janabi yuya irinchi Sinchista ayun chista unas kanji ausay ninchista Chamamamu janapi yuya irinchi Taita Sinchisa ayun chisa Muras kam Sausay ninchisa Chamamamu janapi yuya irinchi Taita Sinchisa ayun chisa Muras kam Sausay ninchisa Chamamamu janapi Chamamamu janapi Chamamamu janapi
Karen?
Oui.
C'est parti. So we really thank O2. O2 made a really incredible show. So O2 Reserve is from Colombia. Karim, I think you should stop your sound. So we thanks a lot O2 Reserve. They have made a wonderful show. It was from Colombia, and now we have Karim from Argentina. Theo, is Karim there? Yeah, we had just. So Karim, you want to talk about what you are doing in Argentina, and did you saw the show of O2? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a really nice project. Close than our. Yeah, and the dynamic and the mind of the project is very, very close. But,
so I think you should also partner with them. What we are trying to do on this Gaia World Tour is to connect different parts of the world. And you are in Argentina, they are in Colombia. They have a strong team, and we will connect you to them. So now I let you explain in Spanish what you are doing in Argentina.
I can't in Spanish. It's really, really hard because I'm here since 8 months, and my Spanish is not it's not enough to explain with the real word what I want to explain. So
okay,
yeah.
do it your way, and you know that after you will have Cassia and Claude coming from Colombia and Brazil to talk also about indigenous people, and they will come with some chief and shaman from Amazonia. So Karim, it's your turn.
What I do is for the PowerPoint presentation, it's right in Spanish, but I will speak in French, and so yes.
So speak in English, but show it in Spanish, because you have now you are in a part of
okay.
Colombia and Brazil and USA on the Gaia World Tour.
So I will try. I do the best that I can.
Okay, let's go.
So, here, for the, can I share the screen?
Yeah.
Yes, for sure you can share the screen. And I will add you on the live.
Share screen. This is okay for you?
Yes.
Okay, so in aquí in Argentina, they have 23 different provincias, and the provincia in the northeast is called Misiones, and this is the only part in the country when we can find Atlantica forest. The Atlantica forest extends in Brazil y también in Paraguay. And at the start, this forest was bigger than now. And we can see on the map in the area in the north, in Natal, there was extend in Natal until in the south of Porto Alegre